Guillermo. Welcome to Emil Guillermo's Takeout. This is our show. Show number 178. Welcome to the show. It's Veterans Day. Hope you paid your respects to the veterans of any race and ethnicity, just all the veterans, all the wars. Today we're going to talk about the veterans again. We got into it yesterday with Professor Dan Gonzalez. I brought him back to talk more about the war effort and how the veterans were so important to the Filipino American community. Then I'm going to talk about Filipino war brides, because without the Filipino war brides, there may not have been as vibrant a Filipino American community starting from post World War II, right? Starting from after the war, the baby boom, there may not have been a baby boom, because what happened was Filipino soldiers, American Filipino soldiers, went to the Philippines and found their brides and brought them back. And they were able to start a middle class. So we'll talk about that. I'll talk about Trump and that January 6th nonsense. We'll talk about Rittenhouse. Inflation's up 6.5%. And the sympathy for Kyle Rittenhouse is up about 10 or 20% after seeing him cry yesterday at his trial. We'll talk about that and lots more. This is our Takeout. I'm Emil Guillermo. Emil, I'm up to you. I call this the Micro Talk Show of the AAPI and the AAXs and all the rest of you, the ALLs. You don't have to be Asian American Pacific Islander, but I'm going to talk about things here over our rice cooker because stuff happens. We have feelings. We have opinions. Like today, WDAAAT. What does an Asian American think? No one asks. But I'll tell you what I think about Veterans Day. I'll tell you what I think about Trump and Kyle Rittenhouse and all that. This is show number 178. As I said, we fill that void. It's a talk show. We talk about things. You can follow me on Twitter at Emil Amok, where you can also see the show on the Twitter viewer. It's not bad. Or you can catch us on the replays where I post on amok.com. I thank you. Thank you for being here. And let's begin. I'm going to talk to Professor Dan Gonzalez about the veterans here on this show 178, continuing on what we talked about yesterday. But there's stuff to talk about. Here's the very latest. First of all, don't think that the Astroworld thing is over. Far from it. Stuff's going to happen each and every day. It's going to be a drip, drip, drip. And now we have the 9th victim of the Astroworld Music Festival. We have Bharti Shahani, a 22-year-old student from Texas A&M. She passed away, 22 years old. As Danish Baig said the other day, he was a Pakistani, an Asian American Pakistani. He said the other day, you go to a concert to have fun. You don't go to a concert to die. Well, here's an Indian American, Bharti Shahani, 22 years old. She went to go see Travis Scott, and they pulled the life support today. So now there's only one victim hanging on for his life, and that's the 9-year-old Ezra Blount, fighting for his life. He's from Dallas. He's in the hospital in Houston. And already 58 lawsuits have been filed, and we're getting all these people talking about what they saw, what happened, how the security was just not there, how they're never going to go see another concert again, their deep disappointment in their guy, Travis Scott, who encourages this stuff. And, there are people who are pointing now to instances in Arkansas, instances in Chicago for Lollapalooza. This is not an isolated thing. Travis Scott was Mr. Surge for the fun of it. At some point, you got to take responsibility. He says he's going to pay for funerals. He says he's going to support people. Bharti Shahani's family said they have not heard from anyone. No one has called them. Asked point blank at a press conference today. No one's called the Shahani family. So now there's 9. And I just don't know how this can end any other way, but you go after the deepest pockets. And it looks like if you've got Live Nation, the largest concert promoter in the world, this is going to have an impact. Unlike all the other things that have happened before where there have been deaths, this is not the first time that people have died from concerts. But in terms of a massive number, this has the potential of changing how we go see concerts. That is not hyperbole. I mean, you can go back to Altamont and say, yeah, well, Altamont, they had the Hells Angels, and there were some problems there. Not a whole lot changed after Altamont. I remember I wanted to go to Altamont. I was a kid. I was 12. I asked my mom to go to Altamont. She said, "Where's that? Where's Altamont?" I said, "Let me just go. I'll just hitchhike." Hitchhike? Are you crazy? So, thank goodness she didn't let me go to Altamont. Anyway, I think this has the potential to change how we do concerts in the future. Keep following the story. Just like Dinesh Baig's family said, support each other, keep the awareness up. Don't let Live Nation, don't let Travis Scott, don't let them ignore that they have a responsibility to the concert going public that was there that night. This just came over the wires 2 hours ago. According to Pop Sugar, Olympic gold medalist Suni Lee said she was recently sprayed in an anti-Asian attack. Suni Lee, who, you saw her at the Olympics, and I said that Suni Lee was going to be the most watchable Asian. And she is. She's the most famous. She's global. And, of course, she goes on Dancing with the Stars. She's an okay dancer. But I don't know. She doesn't seem to be going to school at Auburn University, where she's competing for the gymnastics team. She seems like she's having a good time. Do you think she's thinking about college? But she told Pop Sugar that she was waiting with her friends for an Uber, and a car drove by yelling Ching Chong slurs, telling them to go back to where they came from. Every Asian American knows what it's like to be told, go back where you came from. And every one of us knows the correct answer. I'm here already. And that's what happens. Go back to where you came from. So she said that as she was accosted verbally, she was also pepper sprayed on her arm as the car sped off. Quote, I was so mad, but there was nothing I could do or control because they skirted off, she said. I didn't do anything to them, and having the reputation, it's so hard because I didn't want to do anything that could get me in trouble. I just let it happen. She was mindful. That really is the key. Because if you hit anyone, if you are in an altercation, and let this be a lesson to all Asian Americans, if you are somehow, provoked, if you hit anybody, you'll be seen as the deep pockets. They'll go after you. So Suni didn't ask, but Uncle Emil would say, Suni, 18-year-old kid, you keep being mindful. Don't strike back. Be like the 9-year-old kid from Oakland who says mindfulness is not punching that guy in the face. You don't want to do something that's going to be misunderstood and be litigious and that you will regret. It's unfortunate, but you're famous. Count to 20. Be mindful. Take a deep breath. And be equanimous to it and let it go. Unfortunately, that really is the best thing anyone facing that kind of well, Emil, don't you fight back at all? Yeah, you can like make a loud noise, call attention, get people to join in, call the police. But you're someone like Suni Lee, the most famous, most watchable Asian American. You're asking for it. You're asking for it. So don't. Count to 25. Count to 250. Be mindful. Be mindful. Today is Veterans Day. Reportedly, this is when World War I ended. The war to end all wars. Of course, it didn't end all wars. We talked about Veterans Day yesterday with my buddy, Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez. And I wanted to talk about it because I didn't really intend it. It was intended to be just a pre-show thing for today. But I wrote something for the ALDEF blog, and you can find it on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Here it is. Go to the ALDEF blog. And my piece there, I talk about how, look, everyone in the greater AAPI community has a Veterans Day story. And I encourage you to email me something, maybe a picture or a little story to Emil, EMIL, @amok.com, and I'll share it. I'll post it. I'll talk about as many as I can. For example, I am constantly reminded about the 442nd Regiment, the Go for Broke guys, the Japanese Americans who fought heroically in World War II. I live near a stretch of freeway in California that commemorates them specifically. In other words, every day they help me fight the traffic jams I encounter. I'll never forget the 442nd. And then there's my pal, the late photographer Corky Lee, who worked over the years to let people know about Chinese Americans and their service and how significant that was. We lost Corky in January, so I couldn't just call him and say, "Hey, Corky, tell me about the Chinese." That's what we used to do. But today I want to make sure you remember the 1st and 2nd U.S. Army Regiment of World War II, which was manned mostly by Filipinos in America at the time. And I say mostly by Filipinos because it wasn't necessarily a segregated unit. And it turned out to be, but people gathered there in the central coast of California. They came from all over, from Sacramento, San Francisco, from the central coast, from the valley. And they joined the 1st and 2nd units. And they went into Cebu, the Visayan Islands, right when MacArthur was coming back. And these guys were Americans. And this is what I want to distinguish. They often get conflated with the veterans in the Philippines who answered President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's call to join the USAFFE, the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. USAFE is what usually people call it, which is a totally different thing. You're in the Philippines, you're a Philippine scout, you're a member of the Philippine Army, you're a Philippine guerrilla. The invitation was to join the USAFFE and be rewarded with citizenship. Of course, the big sin was in 1946, the U.S. went back on its word and they screwed the Filipino vets. The Rescission Act is what it was called. FDR promised, Truman took it away. And when people think of Filipino vets, people think about those guys and their fight to be made whole. Of course, I honor them. But I also want to honor these men who were part of the regular U.S. Army. They were the ones who came to the Philippines to the U.S. in the 20s and 30s as colonized American nationals. They were essentially Americans, but they were colonized. And when they came here, they experienced such discrimination. By law, they couldn't own land, they couldn't vote, they couldn't intermarry. And as they found work, they were accused of stealing jobs during the Depression. These guys also formed a bachelor society. They were mostly men. They didn't really bring a lot of women, Filipino women. And just like other groups of Asian men, they were bachelor societies. But when these Filipinos had a propensity for mixing, especially with white women, well, that brought the ire and jealousy of white men. And you want to talk about anti-Asian hate. In the 20s and 30s, after the history of Asian hate in the 1870s and the 1880s, in the 1920s and 30s, it was anti-Filipino, coinciding with the Philippines being imperialized by the U.S. And laws were invoked to change their status. Mostly came out of California. And Filipino men were asked to self-deport. So when World War II began, many felt if I could only prove my loyalty to America, the politics would change. So the laws were passed to allow foreign nationals in the Philippines to join the army. And that's what made the 1st and 2nd regiments different. They were vets, but they were foreign nationals in America. And they were given U.S. citizenship for fighting in the U.S. Army. So you say the 1st and 2nd regiments here, the 442nd here. Yeah, the 442nd had something to prove to everyone that the Japanese Americans were loyal, just like the Filipinos. But the Japanese Americans were American. And the Filipinos and the U.S. were fighting for that respect. So all this I got from Professor Dan Gonzalez, the first academic, one of the first academics to emerge from the San Francisco State Strike in 1968 to form the College of Ethnic Studies, dedicated Asian American and Filipino American Studies classes. He joined me in conversation in show 177, yesterday's show. And the upshot is that without the Filipinos and the Filipino U.S. Army vets, there likely would have been a much smaller Filipino-American community. Because not only did the Filipinos join the 1st and 2nd regiments, they went to the Philippines to prove their worth to the United States, but also to meet the Filipino women they weren't meeting in America. And they met them in Cebu, the Visayan region of the Philippines. Now, if you know anything about the Filipinos and the Visayas, you know they're known for, I don't mean to sound sexist, but they're known for having very attractive men and women. And the soldiers were mostly from Ilocos, which is up north, who, you know, the Ilocanos were seen as smart, but not necessarily the most handsome. That's who the majority of Filipinos were in the 1920s and 30s. They were Ilocano. But during the war, they were in America. They went to the Philippines. They were in the Visayas, and they mixed with the Visayan women. And the women came to be known as war brides, which is both a good and bad thing. You know, what was it, love at first sight or love at first soldier? Yeah, that was the issue. For some, it was a lasting union, but there was often a stigma attached to some women who were looking to escape the Philippines. And there was also the undeniable presence of the comfort women, the Filipino women sold into sexual slavery to serve the needs of the Japanese army who occupied the Philippines. And then there were out marriages of Filipino women who met African American and Latinx soldiers. It all leads to a kind of shame That means usually no one in the community is willing to talk about this history. And yet the positive outcome is that many of those marriages did survive, were great marriages. And the Filipino women came to America with their veteran husbands to start bona fide Filipino American families. We're going to bring on Professor Gonzalez in a second, but his mother and father are examples of such a union, as was his wife's father and mother. The war brides provided the base of the World War II baby boom for Filipinos. Add to that the GI Bill, the laws that allowed for Filipinos in the Army to gain citizenship, and you can see how the mere fact that one was a World War II vet made a difference in Filipinos' lives in America. And this is a big deal. So, you want to know, well, what did it mean to be a Filipino veteran? Well, okay, your cousin was in Iraq or Afghanistan. Yeah, great. But let's go further back. Let's go to World War II. And let's see how World War II was used to help mitigate the racism of the 20s and 30s. Not fully mitigated, but now Filipinos who served had a chance because of the GI Bill to buy homes, get jobs in the domestic military through military connections. It's not hyperbole to say the military is responsible for starting the real first generation of a mass Filipino American middle class. I say this as a pacifist. I say this as a guy who's not necessarily down with the military on all things. But you look at this and you look at what the military did. It was great for those with fathers and grandfathers who were able to join. And of course, my father was 4F. Asthma kept him stateside, working in San Francisco restaurants and not the war. And that made all the difference in the life that was not available to my family in this country. And, it was tough. Here's the thing. You came to I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Filipinos came here without family, and they just looked at each other. And they were instant family. And I put up a picture of my Lolo Rosie and my Lola Frank. I didn't have a Lolo and Lola. They were in the Philippines, but they didn't come here. But my mother met this couple. Lola Frank was he was a sergeant in the Army. And Lola Rosie was his war bride. And they, for a good number of Filipinos who were familyless, they provided a foundation. And, they had the GI Bill. They lived out in the sunset. My father was constantly renting San Francisco railroad flats. We went from one flat to the next, working restaurants. And so we missed out. But I put this picture of Lola Rosie and Lola Frank because I saw my cousin, I call her, Paulette. I saw her posted and I said, God, they were the war brides. That was a war bride situation. I didn't know that. But I salute my Lola Frank, who was a cook like my dad. He worked at Letterman in the Presidio. And I salute my Lola Rosie. She made the best blueberry pie. I should say apple pie because that's American, right? But I don't remember the apple. I remember the blueberry. Because my mother would never make, we wouldn't know what blueberries were until we ate at Lola Rosie's house. Veterans Day. The Filipino American community. That's what was created because Filipinos were able to go to war to prove themselves. And now, let me bring in my friend who talked with us yesterday on show number 177. Joins us again in show 178. Daniel Phil Gonzalez. Daniel Phil. Thank you. Oh, I don't hear your sound. I don't hear your sound.
Sorry, dude.
There you are. Daniel
Thank you
Phil.
very much for having me on again. It's looking
Thank you
good,
very much. Thank you very much.
sounding good. The first regiment and the initial landing of MacArthur's return was at Leyte.
Leyte, the Leyte
Yeah,
landing,
yeah.
right?
So it's one island over from Cebu. Cebu is further to the west.
Thank you for, but it's all part of the Visayas.
Yes, it is. And the reason my parents met was because my mother had been evacuated from her home on Cebu to, well, actually on the Camotes Islands, which are right in between Cebu and Leyte. So
Yeah.
she was evacuated from there because my grandfather was concerned that she might be taken for as a comfort woman to serve as a comfort woman.
Well, that was a real fear. I know that my mom, she never, I mean, I would say in the 80s, I'd say, come on, mom, let's go to Japantown. Let's grab some sushi or something. She had this trauma. She would not go to Japantown
Yeah,
in the 80s. And I didn't realize it until I saw the stories about the comfort women. And they were in the Philippines. They were Filipino comfort women.
yeah.
And
They were often shipped out to other places where Japanese military were having R&R. So they weren't necessarily kept in the Philippines, but yeah, it's
yeah,
one of the worst stories about the war.
yeah. And yet, that was probably that's the negative. But the War
Hmm.
Bright story was a positive story. And I was talking to a woman today. Her my friend Eleanor Clement Glass. Her father came to the Philippines after the war. He was a lieutenant in the army. Met his mother. And I suppose after the army was a little different because the Japanese were out of power. The United States were the power. Was it a little better for war brides and what happened to war brides after the war?
Yes, I think it all came down to what we discussed briefly yesterday, and that was there a courtship?
Uh,
So there were two issues for a lot of the war brides who looked down on other war brides and who did not want to be identified as war brides. One of them was, did you have a formal courtship? And the second was, did you marry a Filipino?
uh,
Okay,
and
so
so,
the
yeah,
interracial issue was a big issue, and a significant number of Filipinas married African American men because there were a lot who served during the war and even were stationed in the Philippines before the war. So there was a significant amount of interaction there. There were others who stayed in the Philippines and established businesses.
yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, there's a lot of that.
yeah. And the thing is, I talked to Eleanor, and she tells me about. She lives in Oakland now. They've been married for a long time, and for a long time, she saw herself as primarily African American, not as Filipino, because most people didn't know what Filipinos were back
It's
in the
true.
40s and 50s. And she was in Kansas. She tells a story about being in Kansas and how people in Kansas thought maybe she was Vietnamese.
Right. So that's fairly recent. I mean, that's after 1975, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so the thing is, she has discovered both her roots, Filipino and African American, and unfortunately, this is one of those things where Filipinos accept it, but they don't really like to talk about it. Is that a fair
That's true.
assessment of how this situation is?
Nakakahiya.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. I mean, and yet it's a beautiful story, It's a story of love. It's a story of integration. And look, the army was segregated back then after the war, and it was segregated during the war too. Uh,
Hmm.
and
It
so
was.
now your father was an enlisted man.
He was. He volunteered for the first regiment. My wife's father also volunteered for the first regiment. Yesterday, what I said we should do is talk about the fact that a lot of Filipino men stayed in the military continuously to retirement, and my father-in-law was an example of that. And then he double dipped.
He
I
left the
Are you
military.
familiar with the term?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he left the military and retired, and then he worked
Retired,
again in the public sector.
right? He worked for the federal government as a policeman. He was he worked for what used to be called the INS,
Hmm.
and
Immigration.
yep, kind of ironic, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
Filipinos who were kept away from immigration and denied that right until after the Second World War, when they secured the right to naturalization. Um, yeah, the about 4,000 Filipinos who served in the first and second regiments were signed up for citizenship. Only 4,000, and there was almost 9,000 total in three battalions. There was a third battalion, but it didn't see action as a
Yeah.
unit. The first and second did. So the notion that the majority of people in the first and second all got citizenship before the war ended is wrong. My father got his citizenship just as the war ended, and clearly before the Rescission Act, right? But
Right.
one of the reasons he got that, and you were clear about that yesterday, is because he was in the U.S. Army. Okay,
Right.
so
I mean, the thing that the reason I want to dwell on this is because when people think of the quote unquote the veteranos, the
yes,
Filipino veterans, they think they conflate both. Like I have uncles who came in the 20s and 30s here to America,
mm,
joined the army, the U.S. Army, and they have all their benefits.
yep,
They don't have any beef with the army. The people who are who were involved in the Rescission Act, they were the Filipinos in the Philippines who were Philippine scouts, who were members of the USAFFE.
right,
They're the ones who are screwed. So I just want to make sure that people know who was screwed and who wasn't screwed.
right.
And probably more were screwed. Would you say?
Oh yeah, larger numbers, definitely. The USFA group is that's a huge category,
Yeah.
and yes, they were huge in number. Um, then we wanted to move on as well to what the when well he double dipped, right. My father George Sobre Pena, my father-in-law George Sobre Pena Palabi, double dipped by joining the federal service, and then he retired from there. So he was pulling two retirements until he passed away. Unfortunately, he passed away relatively young by my family standards. My father didn't die until he was 96, but father-in-law George passed away. I believe he was around 1906. So 1981. What's the math? 81 minus 06. 75. He was only
Wow,
75.
that's young. But I mean, the point though is that these guys knew how to play the system,
Yes.
and they allowed the system to help a otherwise poor Filipino uh, kid rise
Yep.
and do
And
well
and they
in the
passed the
military.
knowledge on to another generation.
Yeah,
My wife's uncle. Okay, so her mother's younger brother. Okay, joined the Navy, and he did the same thing.
right,
He retired from the Navy and then joined the civilian service, but he went through the same gates and did the same job working for the Navy, working on submarines a lot of times. Okay. And but he got paid lots more money as
Yeah.
a civilian.
See, this is
And
the
so
thing.
they did real well. I mean, they had a nice piece of property up in Bremerton, you know.
I mean, look, we're not talking about people who got necessarily wealthy, but we're talking about gaining a foothold in the American middle class. And
Squarely middle class, and
yeah,
some even better than that.
yeah,
I'm not talking about upper class, but upper middle class. Um,
yeah,
and
yeah.
particular, yeah, there were, that
Anything's
happens a lot.
better. Anything's better than if you are relying on eating uh, uh, camates and rice and bagong, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and there were some families where, yeah, that's what we're having.
That was it. That was it, man. Toyo, Toyo, the breakfast of
Right.
champions.
Yeah, we're having Geo for breakfast. Yeah, you want
Yep.
cornflakes? What's wrong with you? You know, I mean, but the thing is,
Frankly, I like the stuff, but that's cool.
well, look, and so do I. I'm just saying that for some families, if you were savvy in how America worked,
Yes.
you took advantage of the military, you
Well,
took
one of
advantage of
the other
the civil
great
service.
advantages to people, even if they didn't retire from the military, was that they got PX privileges.
Oh yeah,
So,
oh
so
yeah,
you got
cheap
the PX
groceries,
and you got the commissary.
cheap
And we
groceries.
used to drive. I took turns with my wife's siblings, and to drive grandma to the PX and
Yeah,
the commissary, especially the commissary. I mean, it was like, you got to understand that, right after the war, Safeway didn't exist yet,
and
right?
Costco didn't exist. This
Yeah,
was big
For
Costco.
sure, for sure that Costco didn't exist, but not even Safeway, and the things that they called supermarkets, right?
Yeah,
There used to be neighborhood markets, right?
right.
And so when they went to the commissary, there was really substantial savings, and
Yeah,
they could buy in large quantities, right? Because the Presidio was still a very active military base with the Sixth Army,
yeah,
and so they were serving the people who were stationed there, as well as all these families in the Bay Area, and particularly in San Francisco and the Peninsula. So,
yeah,
they were doing that all the time. I have retired relatives now who
yeah.
still use the PX. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
those are privileges, and like I said, this is you want to talk about how groups, how ethnic groups get this foothold and how they rise. I mean,
Right.
yeah, sometimes there's a glint of entrepreneurialism, and they go off and start a business.
Especially the moms. A lot
Yeah,
of moms started businesses. Within
right,
our immediate friendship circle, there were at least three beauticians
right.
who
Oh yeah,
opened
the
their own shops.
beauty
That
shop,
they started. Yeah, they
barbershop
started
too.
doing it at home,
Yeah,
and then found enough other beauticians that were willing to work in their shop, and they started their own shops. And so the dad was often engaged in either civil service job, and then guaranteed this retirement income, right? My
yeah.
dad did that. He worked for
Or
the state,
or they go to
and
the post office, right? The
oh, it
post
was
office,
ridiculous. Oh yeah,
post
sure.
the
And
post
the
office.
post office used to pay really well. I worked there for a little less than a year while I was still doing undergrad, and it was the best job I ever had in terms of pay and support.
Yeah.
It was great until I started working for the state of California. Right, the state of California has been very very good to me.
Yeah, I just want to point this out that yeah, right now people are saying, well, like, what does this mean vis-a-vis Bitcoin that I'm into, or what does it mean vis-a-vis the entrepreneurial spirit? Well,
Yeah,
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 but that's 2021. We're talking about the 1940s, the 1950s,
that's right.
and you had to establish a Filipino American and Asian American community, and for many Asian American communities this was the way: the civil service, well,
Yep,
the military and the civil service.
that's right. They
And
also another thing that they did was I want to make sure that we got this in. They sent money back. They continue to send money back home.
sure, sure,
So many of them had sent money back home during their bachelor years, and so after they got married and they brought their families here, you have a lot of families where the one or two the older kids were born in the Philippines, but the rest of the brood were born in the U.S. And so a lot of these people were coming in the late 40s
Yeah.
after I had already had at least one child, right? And they made the trip over in the ship. So even though they were taking care of their own families here, they still sent money back to the Philippines. And
Right.
a lot of Filipinos of another generation born after the Second World War, right, were helped to get higher education. And they went on to college. And they, in turn, became the gate people who came to the United States, often on a student visa for grad school, because they had finished their education for the undergrad in the Philippines and they came here, and then it was easy for them to change their visa to permanent residency at the time. You didn't have the kind of racial barriers, racially motivated barriers that we see today.
Yeah.
So it was relatively easy for Filipinos to change their visa status. If they were unable to get into the United States, they would come in through Canada and Mexico. Most of the people I knew that came in for to the Americas, but not to the U.S. initially, came in through Canada,
Yeah.
right? So I got cousins who came in through Toronto and then dropped into Detroit, and then they went either east or west. They went to New York or the D.C. area, and others went to Chicago, and yet more came to California, right,
Yeah.
and Seattle.
And all this is so important. And it begins with someone signing up for military service to prove that they were valued American citizens. When you talk about and they got their citizenship afterwards,
Right,
the Filipinos who fought in the first and second. And
right.
so I
Well,
just,
I have some quotes. I have a quote from Manuel Buakin, and so if you will tolerate it for a moment,
sure, go
I'll
ahead.
cup. He quotes from Judge Welsh, and Judge Welsh's quote is, "quote Citizenship came to us who were born here as a heritage. It will come to you as a privilege." Okay, and unquote. And I want to. The reason I cite that, and the reason that Buakin cited that, is because of the word privilege, right? Um, you have a privilege differs from a right. A right is guaranteed. You have it whether or not you do anything to qualify for it, other than to gain citizenship. Um, Privilege means that they had to do something to even qualify to try to gain citizenship. And in this instance, that privilege came through their service in the military. And Boakin was very conscious of that. He knew that. Let me read a couple other things. Um, we did not renounce our citizenship in the Philippines. We have now accepted a wider citizenship and a greater responsibility. And he quotes Jose Trinidad, private first class. In one of our discussions in our barracks, Trinidad said, quote, I cannot give up my citizenship in the Philippines. It is in my heart. But America is also in my mind. I wish to have both loyalties. Okay. Now, Buakin goes on to make some really strong statements. Here it is. Here's one. Our citizenship concept has been tolerant. We have assimilated Chinese, modern Malayans, Spanish, and other Europeans, such as the Portuguese. He's talking about the Philippines. And in some ways, our citizenship standards, once again talking about the Philippines, are higher than yours. Listen to how hopeful he was. We have begun our national life, and that means the Philippines becoming its own nation, right? In 46, with the protection of our natural resources from exploitation and ruthless destruction. We shall have no denuded forests as you have, no exhausted lands or heavy concentration of wealth in the hands of the ruthless few. Our citizenship is foresighted.
So some of these members of the military were thinking about, we're going to stay in the Philippines.
Yes.
We're going to forget America.
Yeah. Isn't
America
it
sucks.
ironic though? I mean, this guy wrote this stuff almost 80 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it ironic though that he's talking about saving the Philippines and he's saying in real time in the 1940s, the mid 1940s, he's commenting on what the United States has already ruined
Yeah.
in its own society. You know,
He's talking about protecting the forest. He's talking about the environment. He's talking about things that most people wouldn't consider. What they wouldn't think that, oh, that's what people want. But Manuel Buaken was talking about that, and Buaken again was a Filipino here in America who joined the army. He was in the army when he wrote that, right?
right? He was.
And so,
He also, by the way, he married a white woman, Iris Buaken, and she wrote at least one article. I think she wrote actually several that went into Philippine newspaper circulation. But one of the articles that I use in my class talks about how she was excluded by Filipinas,
uh,
and how they looked down on her. And some of the Filipinas actually said, what self-respecting white woman would marry a Filipino man?"
I'll have to ask my woman.
Ow! Ow!
Yeah, come on, don't you
that's
know
so
you're up
that's
there?
so wrong.
You're on the pedestal already. You're gonna
Oh
like sit
yeah, oh
down.
yeah,
Well, see,
so wrong in so many ways. And
okay,
and I didn't think about that until some friends of mine. I call them the PhD family. They all. I don't know if you remember Paula Bagasao.
oh yeah, I know
Yeah,
Paula.
Paula. Yeah, because she worked on both ends of the continent, just like you did. You know, she worked in D.C. and she also worked in California. She worked for UC for a while,
Yeah,
but her older brother and her younger sister, all three of them PhDs, right?
yeah, yeah.
And at a dinner conversation, I brought up the issue of privilege, mestizo privilege,
Does
and
it exist?
which exists.
Oh, okay.
But Paula broke down and started crying, and I apologized for having said something that offended her. But she said, we did not experience that. She, her mother, and they experienced the exclusion and
As
the
Filipinos.
yeah, the
Yeah,
bullying.
yeah.
And while it's rarer, right, than the other side, the other experience where people who were mestizo were treated better. Um, and it was really basic stuff like nice eyes, a high nose. Remember that mataas ang ilong? Yeah, yeah, a high nose.
Well,
Yeah,
well,
uh, and
Paula
light
was.
skin.
Yeah,
Most of
Paula
all,
was.
light skin, right?
Yeah, Paula was white, half white, and my other friend, Eleanor Clement Glass, being half black, she's had to encounter both sides, racism,
Right.
both sides. There was racism against blacks, and of course, people saw her as black, not Filipino, and then she experienced the racism among Filipinos. So, all of this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of people, when they think of these marriages that come out of Filipino war brides. They don't want to get into it because it's a touchy subject. There's still a certain amount of stigma, but I think we're getting over that, aren't we? A little bit.
Well, I mean, most of the people of that generation who thought and acted that way have passed away. So
Oh,
that's number one. But newer immigrants still bring some of the old traditions.
yeah.
So, for example, I've had students say, uh, after I talk about how some parents want you to do a certain major, and become a doctor, and sometimes it's like be a doctor like your older brother, that kind of thing, or be a lawyer like your grandfather, and all that kind of stuff. Be a nurse, right? But they don't like that major. They want to do something else, and so they have a difficult time. They come to talk to us about it.
Yeah.
And at times, when I mentioned that, yeah, sometimes parents even want to dictate who you marry, and so
Still,
there's the racial barriers, the racial standard, and then sometimes there's even a cultural geographic standard. And
Yeah.
and one woman told me my grandmother doesn't not only want me to marry a Filipino, she wants me to marry an Ilocano, and she wants me to marry an Ilocano from this province, a specific province, right?
Well,
And I
Dan,
said, yeah,
it,
that's kind of a small province too. It's not a, it was Abra, right?
yeah.
It's a, and I was laughing, but I couldn't help laugh, but at the same time, this young woman was going through some stress,
See, here's the thing. We think we've gone over the hump when we
Yeah,
talk about
no,
if we talk about the 20s and 30s and World War II. But the great migration of Filipinos happened in '65 when the immigration gates
and
were
it
open,
continues.
and it continues. And we end up recycling some of these pathways. And sometimes when if we know the history, we'll remember it. But most of the times we don't know the history, and so we repeat it.
That's another aspect, right? I mean, that you said that we didn't have grandparents, and you're right.
Yeah.
We had fictive grandparents. I'm
But
I'm I'm like that too. My grandparents were in the Philippines, both
yeah.
sides, right?
Yes,
No-
me
you know,
too.
although my father offered my grandfather on my mother's side to come to the U.S., and he said I might die there,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
and he lived long enough for us to meet. I mean,
I
I
did
think he
not
lived to 82, which is pretty good.
I did not meet my grandparents.
Yeah.
I
So
only
we
met
had to have fictive grandparents. I was envious of people like Alex Fabros. His mother's parents
yeah.
had a farm
Right,
in Soledad,
right,
and so still within the Salinas Valley, right? And I
right.
remember going there.
Yeah, that's the thing. I you think that we have uh, you know uh, come to an understanding, but we're still recycling, and a lot of it is based on do we know the history or do we not? And I was just reading
Yep.
today where in high school, uh, California high schools will require ethnic history courses to graduate by
Right.
2030. By 2030, and
That's right.
so people will know about Veterans Day and Filipinos and what that means. And they'll know about all these other things that we talk about on this program. But uh, it works as a kind of counter to, the criticism of critical race theory, which, as everyone is trying to, and all these other states are trying to limit,
Yeah.
the amount of history that is taught. California is going the other way and saying, hey,
Yep.
we're going to require it of our high schoolers.
I think Washington is going to be another state that goes that route
Yes,
as
watch.
well.
Yes,
And
I
I
saw
and
that.
I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of the eastern seaboard states do that as well.
Yeah.
So there will be a change in those states, but a lot of that has come about because we have reached a critical period of political and economic development so that we are noticed and at least on the coasts and in those states where we have high concentrations of population.
Oh
They're
yeah,
still getting used to us on the East Coast, but the East Coast Filipinos, as you well know,
yeah,
have a higher socioeconomic status generally.
yeah. Well, a lot of them came as doctors. A lot of them didn't come
Right.
as
Exactly.
field workers.
Doctors, dentists, pharmacists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of them came as professionals, and that came primarily from the '60s education in the Philippines here. And isn't it ironic that their education, which used to be looked upon with suspicion,
Right.
is now the education of choice for white people who can't get into medical schools here in America?
That's right.
They'll, they'll go to the Philippines. They'll go to the Caribbean.
When I
They'll
was teaching at UP, we would run into some of those folks on
yeah,
campus,
yeah,
especially checking into the bank, the
yeah.
campus bank, where all the rich kids went to get their pull their weekly allowances and stuff.
Well, see that now you point out that that's one of the things. There's still a class divide among people who do come here to the Philippines or from the Philippines.
Absolutely.
And that is really the primary difference between the people who came in the 20s and 30s, who were
Exactly.
comfortable in the middle class, working for the government, working for the
Extremely important
postmaster.
point.
Right. And they're not like the Filipinos who came subsequent to post 65, post 80, where they were professionals, well educated, moneyed. Often, they had the money to do whatever they wanted because in the 80s, the Filipinos who came here were part of the like the Lopez's, the landed oligarchs who were on the outs, in the
Well, there
market.
were a lot of martial law, right?
Yeah,
Escapees. I don't want to use that term too loosely, but there were people who actually had been held
yeah,
by Marcos or
Marcos.
some of his cronies during martial law. And I guess one of the great examples of that is the Lopez's.
Yeah, I mean they
Uh,
were they were in exile here. They were in
yes.
exile here, trying to live a modest upper class life down by Stonestown in San
you
Francisco.
could do modest and man, when the Golden Gate Plazas first went up,
Yeah,
when those three complexes went up, Eugenio Lopez
Henny.
got himself a place, man.
Yeah,
And
look,
and he bought two grand pianos. Can you imagine that? Two 8 or 9 footer grand pianos. And I said,
he.
how'd they get him? How'd they get him into the apartment? They said they used the window crane,
Oh wow.
took out the glass, hauled these things up because they wouldn't fit in an elevator, and brought
Well,
them in through the windows. And I said, oh my god, but
you
yeah,
got to have your twin grand pianos.
oh
Hey,
yeah, yeah.
listen, Dan. I always appreciate you coming on talking about history, um, and because I, if I say anything wrong, I say, well, look, the professor says I'm right. The professor says,
Yeah,
I'm
you
not.
could blame it on me,
Yeah,
but then when it comes to the World War II and the military stuff, I'll blame it on Alex. I'll blame it on
it's
Alex Fabros.
no, no. I say that like you corrected me that Leyte was not. It was Leyte, not Cebu. I knew it was Leyte, but
Right.
I looked at Cebu as the broader, bigger Visayan island.
So they do in the Philippines too.
Yeah,
Like the Leyte doesn't get the respect that it deserves.
and
Right.
Leyte though is the important. It's an important war. It's the war that
Absolutely.
Arthur came back in October of the final push, and the Leyte landing is
Yep.
important war in World War II. So look, today we honor the vets. It's not insignificant because of what they did to the Filipino American community, and we honor the war brides, and we honor all the other Asian Americans because the Japanese, the 442nd, that was a significant regiment. The Go for
Yep.
Broke guys.
There were actually Japanese Americans who were caught behind the lines when the war broke out. Actually, when Pearl Harbor was happening, there were already Japanese intelligence officers in the Philippines, and they had to get out via submarine or small plane in order to escape.
Yeah,
Because they were dead either way, right? They could be mistaken for a Japanese member of the military, or by the Japanese
right.
as a Japanese American.
Yeah,
You
and
know.
then also I want to honor the Chinese Americans. My friend Courtney
Yep.
Lee was big on trying to get the Chinese recognized in the same way that the Filipino Americans were recognized with the gold medal. I don't know where they are. I think some of them did get it, or I think they're in the process of that. But it was a significant contingent that were Chinese Americans in the war.
Yeah, that was one of the things that differentiated the Filipinos from other veterans, other Asian American veterans. Obviously, the 442nd was well recognized immediately after the war. The Filipinos were not well recognized, and so the reality is that the exclusion of Filipinos via the Rescission Act, and then the reaction from the Filipino American, the political and legal actions taken by members of the Filipino community to talk about the rescission and talk about the restoration of the right to access veterans benefits, as well as the opportunity for citizenship in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right, they succeeded in 1990, and that's what made it possible for veteranos to come to the U.S. and claim their benefits or fight for benefits, as well as claim citizenship or at least permanent residency. And a lot of them did that.
Right. So now you mentioned the Rescission Act. I do want to talk about that, but another time,
Okay.
because there is a move to try to change that, change the history, and to try to make. I mean, I can't imagine there are many existing veterans who would be affected. It would probably be only symbolic. There might be just a handful who are still alive. But let's talk about that at some point. Today, we honor the vets. We honor of all the AAPI vets, but especially the Filipino.
And all of the following wars, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Korea, Vietnam.
All the
Uh,
wars, right? I mean, it's just that the World War II was so significant in establishing that base,
that's
and
right.
then we got it with more with Vietnam and Korea and all the subsequent wars, and then of course, you could talk about the veterans uh,
Right.
at the Philippine American War, because there was Biden today at Arlington, and one of my big things is at Arlington there is a statue called the Hiker, and the Hiker is like this white soldier who's out for a walk. He looks like he's actually just hiking. Oh, he's going to kill a few Filipinos that he sees along the way.
Yeah, that's right. That's who he was.
Yeah, and the Hiker is a statue that's there at Arlington Cemetery, and it conflates both the deaths of the U.S. Well, there weren't many deaths in the Spanish American War, but it conflates the deaths of the Spanish American War and the Philippine American War,
Yes.
and it
Well,
makes
people
it.
still conflate the two activities.
Yeah, like, well, they were kind of related, but they were separate. They were
Yeah.
very separate.
Yeah.
And we'll have to bring that up again. But I know that Biden was there today at Arlington, and that's where this statue. If you ever see the Hiker, you can go to the ALDEF blog at
Right.
aaldf.org/blog, and I talk about the Hiker in one of my
Yeah.
columns.
We're talking about a president, the current president, who didn't differentiate between people in the military who were caught and then imprisoned as POWs and people who were not.
Right.
It seems to me that in our reflection on veterans, we ought to be thinking about how they've been treated under respective political leaderships, and the contrast between the previous guy
Yeah.
and the current guy, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't be any starker,
Oh, yeah.
which puts the veterans who attacked the Capitol on January 6th in a peculiar kind of perspective, right?
Yeah. Well, let us remember all the veterans who fought in all the American wars, the justified and the unjustified, or the good ones and the bad ones, and then let's also talk about, or let's also respect those who fought and created a life for themselves afterwards, like the Filipino Americans after World War II. So
Yeah, for lots of people,
yeah,
they were often the gateway.
yeah,
They were the ones who petitioned other relatives. My mother certainly did that for her family. That's how my cousins on the Visayan side all got here. All of them, all
yeah.
the women from one family.
They shot their way in. Is that it?
Uh,
No, no, no.
uh,
The war.
they were, my mother started bringing them in the late 70s, right around the time my oldest son was born. He was born
Oh,
in 79. So, these people had already finished college. They were a little younger than me. They'd finished college. They had engaged in some professional work, and now they were on the verge of getting married. I think one or two had already gotten married. One did.
yeah.
And so my mother wanted to bring them in as quickly as she could.
She did. Oh, oh, a little cough. A
Excuse
little
me.
cough. A little cough. Hey, Dan, we got
You
to
want to talk
run.
about Rittenhouse at all? Do you have any time?
No, 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 no. I think Rittenhouse. all that's said is that don't buy the cry. Uh, I think that if the defense wants to move for a mistrial, that would be terrible because then he gets off scot free. But do you think that they have reasonable grounds for a mistrial?
They do have reasonable grounds for mistrial,
Yeah.
but I don't think they want it. I think they think. I think if I were in the defense, I'd be pretty confident that I could win on at least one of the deaths. One of the deaths.
And
It's
self-defense.
yes. The other one where four shots were fired, and according to expert witness, two of them hit the victim. I am not going to honor the judge's position on the use of the term victim.
Yeah.
Uh, and they hit the victim while he was in a horizontal position. So, you know, I think the prosecution has a better chance of getting guilty on that one. But overall, I thought the prosecution really went way over the line a couple of times.
They kind of,
And I think one of the reasons that that's happening is that the judge's perspective on a number of rulings
yeah.
were really questionable.
Eh,
And so, you know,
I think that's sad. But look, here's the thing: we got another trial going on, the Ahmaud Arbery trial, where
yes,
they're saying citizens arrest. They're claiming citizens arrest essentially self-defense, and I think that we need to send a message to people who watch protests or watch things going on television and decide that they're going to get an AR-15 and drive across state lines and join in the fun. If you do that and you get involved, you're getting what you asked for. I mean, I don't see why we've got to protect people who have the intent of going there to create. He says he was just there trying to help people, but he looked like essentially he was there to create mayhem. He was there to join in the fray. I don't think he was there to help anyone, really. So that's my opinion. I'm not very sympathetic toward Rittenhouse, although I didn't realize how much of a kid he was. Um, Maybe what do you give him a mulligan for being young, or do you say that's just an example of a kind of white privilege, that he wants to go off with his AR-14 and join the protest. I
you know.
I don't buy it, but
Well, the prosecution was trying to bring in all of his prior activity with regard to the gun. The acquisition of the gun,
yeah.
whether or not he had knowledge of the fact that it was completely illegal for him to have possession of it,
Mhm.
right? And they tried to clean that up by making him look as though he really didn't know that much about the gun, and that he bought it because he thought it was cool. He had his friend buy it because he thought it was cool. All of that stuff probably works on the jury. And
Yeah.
I think his crying worked on the jury. I
I
agree
think
with you. You
I,
shouldn't buy the cry.
I think the crying does work on the jury. Unfortunately, that's why I think there's an inflation on the sympathy toward Kyle Rittenhouse, and I don't. I think that's a bad thing. Hey,
Well,
anyway,
he's got a target on his back, and he got deserted by some of the super right wing gun enthusiast groups
yeah, I didn't know.
because they don't like it when people like that start waving guns around irresponsibly. And in this instance, he went the whole route,
Yeah,
and he shot three people, and two of them died. So the people who rally around the notion of responsible gun ownership, right? Sportsmanship,
yeah,
gun safety. This guy is not a hero in his eyes, but
yeah.
he's a hero in the eyes of people like those who attacked the Capitol on the
O-
6th of January.
All right, Dan, we're gonna leave it there, as they say. Thank you very much for joining me,
Well,
Dan.
I'm looking forward to your next show. I like watching your shows.
Well, thank you. Tell your friends about him. We're here on amok.com, also on Emil Amok at actually Emil Guillermo on YouTube. at Emil Amok on Twitter. So however you choose to see it, I do appreciate you and your vast sense of knowledge. As are you emeritus yet? Not quite, right?
I will be after next semester.
Okay,
Yes.
so
I,
not quite emeritus from the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, Asian American Studies, Filipino American Studies, Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez. Thank you very much.
thank you. Thank you. It's great being on once again. Thanks for the privilege.
Thank you. There's Dan. Dan's just a good, you just want to talk about Rittenhouse now? Sure. Okay. We just talk about Filipino vets. World War II. We can talk about Rittenhouse. I mean, I don't really have a whole lot to say about Rittenhouse, except that we shouldn't send a signal to people that it's okay to be vigilantes in America. That's not right. You killed two people, you're going to have to pay the price. Simple. All right. So at this point, we start up our music. Thank you very much again, everyone. I like to say, hey, be here, bang the gong now. Facebook at emilguillermo.media, amok.com. That's where you can see some of our replays. This was show number 178, where we talked about Veterans Day and Filipino war brides. Do catch What Dad? What does an Asian American think? Show number 177, yesterday's show, because that's also interesting. Let's see. We call this the Micro Talk Show, or the API and the AAXs, and all's the rest of you. You can email me. And like I said, seriously, if you have a veteran story you want to share, email me at Emil, E-M-I-L, at amok.com. Go see my column on the veterans at aldef.org/blog. So thank you for joining me. Yeah, boy, I am feeling weary of being boosted. I have to admit that I didn't think that I would get my butt kicked from the booster shot. But slowly but surely, I've got a little fever. I'm feeling a little, and I know it's not the blueberries I ate. But really, thank goodness I didn't do the flu shot, and they wanted to give me some pneumonia shot and a tetanus shot all at the same time. Oh my God, I'd been shot up. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. Join me again tomorrow. Those regular listeners, we come to this point, and this is our moment where we say, hey, we offer ourselves our kind, loving compassion, self-compassion, self-kindness. If you're feeling kind of rotten for whatever reason, you're feeling some shame. Maybe you feel shame about being a war bride. There's no reason to feel shame about being a war bride. Love yourself. Love your mom. Love your dad. Love, love, love. Beatles were right. Give yourself an elbow hug. And as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you live with ease. Till tomorrow, Emil Guillermo here. Mahal Kita.